began his academic training at the universities of Tübingen and Marburg in Germany, and then came to the US in 1991 as an exchange student himself at Washington University in St. Louis. There he earned 2 master's degrees, one in European Studies and a second one in history. He received his PhD in history from Brown University, was a postdoctoral fellow at Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis, and since 2000, Professor Biess has been a faculty member at UC Diego's Department of History. And many of you know Frank recently served as our UCEAP's 2018 to 2020 return. He was our Northern Europe Faculty Director residing in Berlin. Professor Biess's research has primarily focused on the post-1945 period with an emphasis on memory, emotions, gender, and political cultures. Frank is an immensely productive scholar. Looking at a CV, in addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, Frank has published 7 books. I'm going to share a few of the book titles just to give you a glimpse of his scholarly work and research interest. One of his earlier books was Homecomings, Returning POWs and the Legacies of Defeat in Post-War Germany, that was published in 2006. Another one, Conflict, Catastrophe, and Continuity in Modern German History in 2007. Science and Emotion After 1945, A Transatlantic Perspective in 1914. And his most recent book published this year is German Angst, Fear and Democracy in Post-War West Germany. I should point out that a German version of this book, Die Republik der Angst, came out first last year and was a finalist in the nonfiction category for the Leipzig Book Prize. Congratulations, Frank, on your many scholarly achievements, and thank you for taking the time from, I know, your many academic commitments to share your work and experience with us today. The title of Frank's presentation today is Corona Angst, a historical perspective on the pandemic in Germany and the US. And I'd like for all of us to give Professor Biess a warm UCEAP welcome. And I just learned yesterday that there's a digital clap on your optional chat functions, or you can give a visual clap as Vivian, I, and Bruno are doing. All right, take it away, Frank.
Okay, so I will try to share my screen here. Hold on. With my presentation. Now you see, hold on. Can you see the title of the presentation? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Zhu, for this very nice introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here. UCEAP is such a great organization, and I feel deeply honored to have been invited to share my research, or part of my research, with you here. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for inviting me to this great event. I actually, just looking at the names, I did recognize some alumni from the last 2 years in Germany. Tobias, I saw you, for example. So it's great to see you guys again. So it's good. These are good times to be a historian of fear, unfortunately, because there's so much of it going around at the moment. And I want to talk about this particular fear of the pandemic at the moment. It's a little bit difficult for me because historians usually talk about things that have already happened, where we know the outcome and therefore can arrive at a sort of historical assessment. In this case, I talk about things that are still going on, and of course we don't know the outcome. So everything I say, of course, is provisional, and I might be proven wrong by the future, but that's just a risk that I have to take. So I divided my brief presentation here in 3 parts. I first want to talk a little bit about pandemics in history in general, maybe also as a way to bring into view some of the historical specificity of our current predicament. And then I will focus on COVID-19 in Germany and the US. I'm just going to give you some numbers, some statistics, and then I'll try to explain what the difference between the two countries is. And I should say I will focus on the German situation. I feel like I'm an expert on that country. As far as the US are concerned, I'm as much of an expert as everybody else in this meeting here. So I'm also just curious what you think about how the US situation compares to the German situation, but I'll limit my comments to the German case. So we are undoubtedly in a global pandemic. At the moment, we have about 38.6 million cases, 1.1 million people died. As you see from this curve, there is no sense that the pandemic is declining. On the contrary, it seems like the new cases are still rising. Maybe you've seen this graph before. If we compare the COVID-19 pandemic with other pandemics in history, we see that it's still much, much smaller than, for example, the HIV/AIDS pandemic or the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, but it's already larger than some of the worst flu pandemics in history. For example, the so-called Asian flu of the 1950s, or the Hong Kong flu of 1968, which cost the lives of about 1 or 1.1 million people. And it's also much larger than some of the recent pandemics we've had, Ebola, SARS, or the swine flu, which were much smaller than the current COVID pandemic. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think COVID and also the recent pandemics have really sort of undermined what has been called the epidemiological optimism of the post-45 world. So after 1945, we all hoped and believed that we've essentially eradicated infectious diseases. With the eradication of smallpox, the polio vaccine, which of course was invented right here in La Jolla at the Salk Institute by Jonas Salk in 1955. And it might be important to remember that in the post-45 periods, Americans actually feared polio just as much as they feared nuclear war. So this was a real threat, and this threat seemed to have been essentially conquered by the invention of this vaccine. Now, this optimism was undermined already by the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s, and you've seen in the previous graph just how bad the AIDS pandemic was and still is. For a while, that could be relegated, that it only affected a certain part of the population, gay men, essentially. Now we know that's not true, and it took a while until it was recognized that this is a pandemic that threatens everybody. And there is, of course, also this noticeable increased frequency of pandemics since the early 2000s. And I'll say something about this in a moment. But from a historical point of view, it's also interesting to see that the reaction to some of these pandemics actually differed considerably. And so these are not just natural reactions, but they're also historically specific, and they have a lot to do with the historical context in which they occur. So for example, the so-called Asian flu or Hong Kong flu really didn't get much attention, certainly not in Germany. And I think the same is true in the US as well. It was sort of accepted, but it wasn't really a big, seen as a big crisis. It wasn't really discussed very extensively. And it was a much more muted public reaction to this. And the question, of course, would be also, why is this? Why is there this very sort of intense reaction to COVID and a much more muted reaction to these past influenza epidemics? And one idea I have is that in this period, and this is true certainly for Germany, I'm not so sure about the US, but death was much more present in people's lives. For example, infant mortality in Germany in 1955 was still 45 out of 1,000 newborns. Today, it's 4 out of 1,000 newborns. So there was a much greater sort of familiarity with the fact of people just dying prematurely. And of course, the legacies of World War II played a role there as well, certainly much more in Germany than in this country. But the fact that there was premature death was something that people knew and sort of accepted. This, of course, is different today. I think today there's a real emphasis on the importance of individual lives. Maybe one of the accomplishments really of modernity is the fact that we no longer want to accept, premature death. People should be entitled to live a full and healthy life. And in Germany, this is even more important because of this Nazi legacy of, killing mentally ill and disabled people. They actually talked about life unworthy of life. And partly as a reaction to that, today there's this emphasis that every life is worth saving, right? So there's a much greater emphasis on these individual lives, and I think that might explain some of the reaction also to this pandemic. Now, I would also say that there is this sort of paradoxical modernity of COVID-19, and let me just explain what I mean by this. So on the one hand, of course, COVID and these other recent pandemics are very much a product of our modern world. They're not caused by globalization, they're caused by the intrusion into wildlife and the sort of jump of viruses from animals to humans, but then they're very much spread as a result of this increasingly interconnected world. I mean, the virus doesn't respect national boundaries, and because of these increased connections, it spreads more rapidly. It's also a distinctly modern threat. And what do I mean by this? Well, it's something that's invisible. We cannot detect it with the senses, just like, for example, radioactivity. It's the same thing. And this is why we need to rely on experts to communicate the threat to us. We cannot perceive it ourselves. So experts all of a sudden have this very important status in even explaining to us why this is dangerous. So all of these are real features of the modern world. But I think that, before we have a vaccine, and of course that's also part of modernity, this very intense effort to find a vaccine. But in the absence of a vaccine, we're really forced to adopt essentially defensive and in many ways pre-modern measures to fight the virus. So we wear masks, we practice social distancing, we quarantine those who are infected. And these are essentially the same measures that were adopted in the pre-modern period to fight the plague. They're not much different. We don't have any other instruments available, but I would argue that these measures go against some of the dominating tendencies of late modernity of our modern world, this emphasis on individualism, on personal autonomy, and on having connections really across the globe, thanks to organizations like UCEAP. So what does this mean? What are some of the possible consequences of this contradiction? And I think that's very much an open question. We just don't know. We know that this is a threat that affects our daily life more than many other challenges we face, maybe with the exception of climate change, especially here in California. But one possibility, of course, is that this will lead to a new kind of deglobalization, that we associate the virus with globalization and we say, okay, we have to pull back from globalization. And there's actually a historical parallel to this. I think this was very much the reaction in the post-World War I world, probably also in response to the experience of the Spanish flu, when countries turned inward, when they emphasized protectionism, nationalism, when they tried to become self-sufficient, independent of the world markets. And we know that this ended in a disaster. It culminated in the rise of fascism and ultimately in the outbreak of World War II. But I think this is definitely one option at the moment. The other one, of course, is that we say, okay, we now realize we can only fight pandemics like this through increased international solidarity and through cooperation. And I think which of those two models and which mixture of these responses will result from this pandemic is very much an open question. And I think it's a very important debate that we will have to have. Now let me move on to my second part. I just want to compare and contrast the experience of COVID in Germany and in the US. And in a way, because we now all have become obsessed with these statistics, this of course lends itself very much to national comparison, maybe not always for the right reasons, because we of course know that the numbers are produced in very different ways in different countries and are not always reliable, but still I'm gonna use them here. So the first difference, of course, is that the number of total cases in the US is much higher than in Germany. This is from a few days ago when it was 7.8 million cases. I think it's probably a little bit higher now. In Germany, it was 329,000 cases. So the US has more than 23 times cases than Germany, even though the US population is only 4 times larger. The latest day count is from yesterday, 59,000 in the US. Germany actually yesterday had the highest rate of new infections ever. So they've reached a new high with more than 7,000 infections per day. So this is the curve in the US. You see it hasn't flattened. It seems like hardly flattened. The cases have increased. In Germany, it looks very different. You can see there's a spike in the spring. And then Germany actually succeeded in reducing infections to almost zero, but they've gone on up rapidly again, actually in recent days. And as I said, we have now the highest number ever yesterday, which has triggered the immediate reintroduction of some of the measures from last spring. So there's a mask mandate now, large gatherings are restricted, bars need to close at 11. It's not quite a full lockdown, but some of the measures from spring have been reintroduced. Sometimes it's argued that the higher numbers in the US result from more testing. It's true, the US does more tests than Germany, but the US also has a much higher positivity rate of those tests. So this shows that the pandemic is indeed more widely spread in the US than in Germany. Another important distinction, of course, is the number of deaths. So in the US, I don't know if you can see it here, it's 664 per 1 million. In Germany, it's 116 per 1 million. So it's almost 6 times higher in the US than in Germany. And that's already adjusted for the population. The absolute number of deaths in the US, 217,000. In Germany, almost 10,000. Yeah, okay, so here you see my arrows. Now, let me just say a few words about the other really important consequence of this pandemic, and that's the economic impact, because there you see that the economic impact in Germany and the US was almost the same. So in the US, the projection is that the GDP will decrease by 5.9% this year. In Germany, it's 5.8%. But what's important is that the social consequences of this economic impact actually were very different. So in the US, you have this huge spike of unemployment from like 4% to 14%, and now it's slowly going down again. We're at 8% now. Unemployment in Germany has increased only a little bit, from 5 to 5.9%. Why? Because Germany has this other instrument available, which is reduced working hours, short-term work, Kurzarbeit, which means that people are not laid off, but they just work shorter hours. And the employer pays them for those shorter hours, and a part of the difference to their regular salary is made up by the state. So the state essentially steps in, and the idea is to preserve jobs so that when the economic crisis is over, they can go back to, and they've never lost their jobs, and they can just go back to normal working hours. This is, of course, very expensive. The expected costs are about 10 billion euro per year, or 12 billion US dollars. Still, the measures fighting the pandemic have been quite popular, and Chancellor Merkel has these incredible approval ratings still. So in September, 86% of Germans said that they approved of the job that Merkel was doing, and only 13% did not approve. So, you know, huge popularity of the government, basically. So let me get to the last point and try to explain this, this difference. And again, as I said earlier, I'm going to focus on what I think Germany might have done right, and won't comment on the US case. And I've listed actually 5 reasons that explain at least the German initial success, although this now is again, you know, thrown into doubt again. So the first reason would be leadership. The deliberate leadership style that Merkel has adopted, which included from the very beginning close consulting with the minister presidents of the individual states, sort of the governors. Germany has a very strong tradition of federalism, so a lot of it is actually decided within the individual states, but she's always tried to communicate with these people. She sought a consensus between the political parties to make this, you know, to make sure that these measures have a very strong kind of political consensus. And she really made a point listening to scientists, to public health experts. She's a scientist herself. And this guy on the image here was very important, Christian Drosten, who is the chief virologist from the largest hospital in Berlin, and actually does research himself on coronaviruses. So he really knows what he's talking about. Reason number 2, I would say, has to do with civil society. And I experienced this myself because, as Zhu said, I was faculty director in Germany when the pandemic started. And there seemed to be a high voluntary cooperation with the government, a great deal of understanding for these restrictions, and actually a significant trust in the government and in the state. So I think that is a sort of feature of political culture that was important here, even though there were also coercive measures. So there was a mask mandate, for example, in public transportation. This is a picture from the subway in Berlin. And I can say from my own experience that most people really adhered to this mandate. Reason number 3 would be a good public health system. As you know, in Germany has universal health insurance. Nobody is allowed not to have health insurance. And this meant that people often went to see a doctor when they just had mild symptoms, when they were not really sick. So many of them could still be helped by medical interventions. They didn't just go to the hospital when they were already very, very sick. The 4th reason, I would say, has to do with a weak and ultimately discredited opposition. Last summer, I think Germany in some ways became the victim of its own success. There were a growing number of people who felt that these restrictions were not necessary because there were hardly any new infections. And there were actually fairly large demonstrations, anti-corona demonstrations in Germany against these measures. But these demonstrations then also were quickly discredited because it became clear that sort of right-wing extremist forces tried to instrumentalize them for their own purposes. So on the picture at the bottom, you see this guy with this black, white, red flag, which are actually the colors of the German Empire. And you may know that in Germany, it's prohibited by law to display Nazi symbols. So a lot of the neo-Nazis resort to these kind of pictures or colors of the German Empire. And I don't think, I mean, there's still people who think that this whole pandemic is a hoax. It's invented by Bill Gates or whoever. But it's not really something that has the support of any major political party. So it's, I think, fairly marginalized. And the last reason has to do with historical factors. And this is where my own work comes in. In these books that Shuzu mentioned, I tried to write the history of post-war Germany as a history of fear. And I tried to show that post-war German history actually was also a history of a series of crises, of cycles of fear. And I think this also means that Germans are actually quite familiar with this experience and perhaps also have some expertise in managing these kinds of crises. What I also try to show in the book is that fear is not just a negative emotion, but that it can also actually have a productive function at time, and that it actually did have a productive function in post-war German history. For example, there was always this fear in post-war Germany that the country would revert to some sort of authoritarian past, some sort of repetition of the Nazi past. And this fear, I think, was actually very helpful for post-war Germany. It was an asset in this process of post-war democratization because it sensitized Germans to potential threats to democracy. And I think at the moment, fear also might have a productive function as well. It tells us to be careful, to take care of ourselves and of others, and to try to avoid the further spread of this pandemic. So I think we can see a similar function of fear in the present as well. This is all I have to say. Danke, or thank you, and I look forward to your questions, comments, or also to your criticism. Thank you. And let me stop sharing my screen here. Okay. Okay.
Shizu, be sure you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just had that capability. I couldn't earlier. All right. Well, thank you, Frank, for such an interesting and informative presentation, and providing us with this historical and global perspective on a topic that's on everyone's minds today. I especially, appreciated you pointing out the potential impact, right, of deglobalization. And then, of course, the comparative differences that you identified. I want to just check in the chat. Will you help me do that, Elizabeth or Bryn, to identify if there are any particular questions that anyone has?
So far, I haven't seen any explicit questions, so we'll just wait and see if anyone decides to submit any, and I'll, here's their first one. Any predictions on the outcomes in the US for both COVID and democracy if Trump is reelected is the first question.
That's a question to me. This is the kind of question where I always resort to my expertise as a historian. I deal with the past, not with predicting the future. So, I really would say I am as much of an expert on this as everybody else. And, my view is not, more well-founded than everybody else's. So I would like to refrain from actually making a prediction here.
Bryn, do you see another question on the chat here?
I do. So Marilyn Riley would like to know if the Spanish flu started in the US.
Right. Well, what we know is that the Spanish flu did not start in Spain. Okay. And of course, there's a whole history to sort of naming these pandemics as a way also of locating them somewhere else. The Asian flu or something like that. And fortunately, most of us have moved away from that because it was often also a way of, making it someone else's problem. It's not quite clear where the Spanish flu started. It might have started in, I think, in Kansas, where the first cases occurred, but it could also be that it started in northern France. So I think there's still some debate about that, but these are the two, I think, most likely candidates.
Wonderful. Our next question is from Janet, who's asked, what caused the spike in Germany in September?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we're still trying to figure that out. I mean, it's pretty clear that most cases seem to be concentrated in big cities and also mostly, I think, among younger people. Just like here, younger people who basically did not want to accept these restrictions anymore and probably were less careful, and now the new restrictions apply primarily to the cities. I mean, for Berlin, it's terrible to tell them that the bars should close at 11. They're famous for having bars open all night, but it seems like a good idea at this point to do that. Yeah, that's all I can say at the moment. And that they really quickly reintroduced some of the measures. And they also say now we've learned from the past. So, we have an experience of actually flattening the curve. And this might tell us what we need to do now when the cases are going up again. And of course, it gets colder. People spend more time in indoors, which increases the risk of spreading the virus, all those factors.
And Kelly from Spain in 2002 asks whether Germany has some sort of stimulus, plan, and what your thoughts are on this method of government help.
Yes, there was a huge stimulus, and it was really interesting. I mean, they, for example, also gave money to, say, artists or writers who, sort of independent, people who were not employed anymore, but who still were massively affected by the pandemic. So I think you could actually claim something like up to 10,000 euro if you were, an independent artist, for example. And I mean, what's of course also interesting in this pandemic is that things become possible that previously did not seem to be possible. Huge government aid in many different ways, also closing borders. I mean, this was even during the refugee crisis for good reasons. Germany did not close the border. In the pandemic, they did it. Or the sort of European assumption, European stimulus programs, where the Germans basically take on some of the financial responsibility for poorer European countries. This also did not happen during the Euro crisis. So all of a sudden, there are these new possibilities for political intervention that seem to be possible. And some commentators have said, well, couldn't we apply this to the problem of climate change as well? Maybe it would be possible to have much more drastic measures that people previously said would not be possible, but now we've seen that many things have become possible all of a sudden. So yeah, I think the stimulus program was really important, and it certainly contributed to the fact that the economic contraction was not as bad as it could have been, and that the social consequences especially have been mitigated.
Wonderful. Along that same vein, Marilyn Riley, Germany, 1966, wanted to see if you could comment on the same experience, the same topic in Sweden.
Right. Well, yeah, I've read about this, and I know it's often sort of presented as an alternative, with fewer restrictions. But from what I've read, and there was an article, I think this morning, it might have been even in the New York Times, that Sweden actually had very high case rates compared to the population, and that their infection rate is actually very high. So it's kind of difficult to portray this as a success. And it's it's a country that's fairly sparsely populated. So in a way, it probably would have been easier in Sweden to maintain some social distance than in big cities, and yet they've had comparatively high infection and actually death rates as well. Yeah, in my capacity as faculty director, of course, I got to go to Sweden a few times, and it's a wonderful country, and I love the place. But I have my doubts that this would be the model for how to fight the pandemic.
From Kenneth Tom, Germany, 1973 and 1975. His question is, could you comment on the success in dealing with COVID in some East Asian cultures, which are more collectivistic societies versus individualistic cultures like US and Europe?
Yeah, maybe you've given the answer already in your question. I don't know. I have to say, and I don't know anything about that part of the world, but I do know that before the pandemic, I actually visited East Asia for the first time, I think in 2007, 2018, we went to Taiwan. And one of the things we noticed was that everybody was wearing masks in Taipei. And at first I didn't quite understand, is it to protect himself? Is it to protect others? My teenage son thought this was very cool. And he also wanted to get a mask and to wear it because he somewhat just, liked the look of it. But that's something we definitely noticed. And obviously now many Western countries are emulating this practice that has been very common in East Asia, right? That people just wear masks in crowd. And maybe this will be a sort of permanent consequence of this pandemic, right? It sort of really changes also the look of our public sphere. And there is something about masks. If you have a place, a country, or a culture that's very much emphasizes individualism, and if you think that the face is the sort of best expression of your individuality, so concealing the face, of course, has a sort of, and of course we've had this debate with, the hijab and in Muslim cultures, and there it was seen very negatively because everybody in the West said, well, we want to see your face because that tells us who you are. And all of a sudden we're in a situation where it seems like it's a really good idea to wear masks.
Cristina Martinez Carazo, Spain 2019 to 21, where she was also a faculty center director. Is there a disencounter in Germany between politics and health needs?
A disencounter. Yeah. I think I need some help in
I do too.
Precisely understanding the question.
Christina, do you want to put in the chat what you meant by disencounter, and we can move on to the next question, and then I'll see what you rephrase in your chat, perhaps. I think the next question, let's see, I see is Lauren from Madrid, 2006, 2007. Clearly, there is a connection between those falling victim to COVID-19 and economic disparities, which are less dramatic in Germany than they are in the US. Can you elaborate on how you saw these disparities influencing Germans and if the government elevated its reaction knowing this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, probably by all measures, I mean, social inequality in Germany has also been increasing over the last few decades, but it's not, as great as in this country. I think some of the same mechanisms applied, that there were people who just, could not afford to stay home. It was basically the educated middle class who then reverted to the home office, and many other people working in other jobs, they could not afford this luxury. So I think, I don't know any statistics that would, investigate to what extent poorer people were more affected by COVID in Germany, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case as well. And in the US, of course, we know that that's the case, right? So we know that Black men are statistically the most likely victims of COVID. And I've realized when I wrote my presentation, and I wrote this thing about how we value each individual life, I paused for a moment and I thought about, well, is this really true? Because it does seem like that some lives are more valued than others, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something to remember as well.
Let's see, in Christina's question, about the relationship between politics and health needs, she's elaborated, I am thinking about the tensions between the regional governments and the central one in Spain and the negative consequences that is having in this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, in this country, this whole question has been extremely politicized. In Germany, it has been politicized to some extent as well, because some of these politicians in different states then adopted different measures. And, sometimes they thought not only about health reasons, but also how this would go over politically. I mean, what's sort of interesting is that at the beginning of the pandemic, and this maybe gets away a little bit from your question, but maybe not. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this real concern that this is a situation that your authoritarian leaders would try to exploit, and it would actually somehow strengthen them. But if you look around, that actually does not seem to have been the case. And that the countries that arguably fared the best were actually the more sort of democratic countries, and some of the more authoritarian countries, I think, however you want to define that, maybe did not do so well. So maybe there is something to be said for this kind of democratic process of consultation, of trying to bring the population along, of convincing the population that this is the right way to do. And I can only, certainly in the German case, I think that has worked at least to some extent.
And then from Karen Shaw, being German, I keep up with the German news and listened to yesterday's press conference by Merkel and Söder. They were pretty dramatic about COVID danger on health and economy, pleading with the population to unite to protect the country. It seems to me that the focus on economy might be more real than the fear of COVID. I don't see the US government making that case. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear by now that this kind of, false alternative between saving the economy and fighting the pandemic, that it is indeed a false alternative, that the two things are inextricably intertwined. And we know this from historical cases as well. There's this famous study of, these two cities during the Spanish flu. I think it's St. Louis and Pittsburgh. And St. Louis had an earlier lockdown and a longer lockdown, but did economically actually better than in the long run than Pittsburgh, because, or was it, maybe it was Philadelphia, I don't know, because they opened much earlier. So I think it's pretty clear by now that controlling the virus is essential for economic recovery, and that this idea that this is an alternative is just a false dichotomy.
I'm going to move into a different question. Would you tell us about your experience as the recent faculty director in Germany, and perhaps relate that to your own study abroad experience as a student and its impact?
Well, I was fortunate that while I did study abroad, there was no pandemic, so I wasn't affected by that. But, I mean, I've said this often, the fact that obviously, going on a study abroad program had a dramatic impact on my life. I came here in 1991 as an exchange student, actually to St. Louis, Missouri, and in a way I never went back. So it really changed my life. That's why I'm such a big advocate for study abroad in general. And I was so thrilled that you guys sent me to Germany as the faculty director there. And I loved the experience. And of course, it was really disrupted then by the outbreak of the pandemic. And it was a very interesting period because, the students were supposed to go home, but then there were also quite a few students who actually preferred to stay in Berlin for all kinds of reasons. And I really appreciated, UCEAP's flexibility in making it possible for those students to stay in Germany. And some of them actually stayed until the end of the semester. They took online classes at Berlin University. Some of them took online classes in California while still living in Berlin. But I saw this as an opportunity to give back to some of the students what I've experienced myself as an exchange student, and the incredible value of studying abroad. And of course, I don't have to explain this to this audience because you all experienced this yourself.
In reading your CV, the title of the book, Homecoming, I wanted to ask you if you would tell us a little bit about your first book, Homecoming, and how that research led to your subsequent interest in the history of emotions, the history of fear and anxieties.
Yeah, so this was a study that basically looked at the experience of returning soldiers and POWs after the Second World War, who came back mostly from Soviet captivity to East and West Germany. And so it was a comparative study that looked at East and West simultaneously, which was made possible by the collapse of East Germany and the opening of East German archives. And it was very important for me to put together this East and West German story. It was, of course, also then, sorry, clear that these people had left Germany, at the height of the Nazi period, and then they came back to these two countries that had radically changed. The one being a sort of liberal, democratic, capitalist country, the other one communist dictatorship. And I realized that there was a lot of, the way they reacted had a lot to do also with the sorts of emotions that they displayed. And with these people especially, I mean, they of course then also tended to have this strong fear of communism, of Russia because of their experience there. So this is how I got into the history of emotions. In part, actually, also because of my own autobiographical experience. And I talk about this in the book, because as you said, I grew up in Germany, and sort of my first kind of politicization was in the early 1980s during this peace movement, which had to do with this deployment of US nuclear weapons in Germany. This was the largest protest movement in the history of post-war Germany. So, there were these huge demonstrations with 500,000 people or so. And I participated in those as well. It became clear to me in retrospect that the whole movement was driven by fear, fear of nuclear war. And that actually the sort of open display and the performance almost of fear was seen as a good thing. It showed that you saw something that maybe people without fear did not see. So that led me to this question, okay, maybe there were other episodes in post-war German history where we can see that as well. Or I wanted to understand, how at that point we got to this point that fear was seen as this actually very positive emotion, as someone called it a higher form of reason. So that's how I got into this project.
Thank you. I'm fascinated with the topic of your new project, which is Weimar in the World, a global history of Germany's first democracy. Could you just, we have a few more minutes, could you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so this project tries to address the question that I actually mentioned in my presentation also, because, as I said earlier, after the First World War, there was this strong push for basically withdrawal from the world, for independence. And this was true in Germany too, partly because of the experience of the Spanish flu, also because during the First World War and shortly thereafter, the British actually imposed this blockade on Germany, which cut off Germany from food imports and caused this massive famine during World War I. So there was this sense that Germany was too dependent on world markets for its basic existence, for securing the food supply. And this led to this demand for self-sufficiency, for autarky, for, as Hitler then called it, living space in the East, basically conquering territories that then could secure Germany's food supply. So a real push towards deglobalization. And at the same time, I think, this was a period when Germany was perhaps more integrated in the world than at any time before. There was this influence from the US, Hollywood and jazz. There was new forms of communication, so people could read about what was happening in India, all over the world. So there was these competing tendencies between, deglobalization on the one hand and a sort of increased integration into the world. And this was represented by different political positions as well. And, you know, ultimately the deglobalization won out, but I'm interested in sort of analyzing this debate because I think it is not too dissimilar to the same questions that we face today as well.
Thank you. So my last question is non-academic, is very lighthearted. And so I asked Frank about his hobbies, and he told me his hobbies included running, biking, reading, and cooking, and he's a big soccer fan. So my last quick question is, tell us what your favorite German dish is to prepare, or your favorite one to consume if they're not the same. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so my favorite German dish is Sauerbraten mit Spätzle. And I'm actually, I don't know if you know what that means. It's this marinated meat with Spätzle. Those of you who spend time in southern Germany will know what it is. It's this particular kind of pasta. And even though I love to cook, I'm not quite there to make it myself. So I have to go home and, you know, hope that my mother will cook it.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. It's been delightful and just very inspirational as well as informative. And so we really appreciate your time in the presentation and answering all of our many questions. So a big UCEAP clap again.
Well,
all right.
thank you.
Thank you.
I'll turn it back
for having
to
me, and thank you for these
Yep.
really interesting questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Frank, so much. And thank you, Shuzu, for being our moderator. There was a request in the chat to share the slides. So Frank, I'll get a copy of that from you and we can
Yes,
send it out
sure.
via email. We also want to, ask for your feedback. Thank you all of our alumni for participating. This was our first presentation like this. So we'll send an email and ask for if you have any comments about format or presentation, and also on future topics. So if you have any suggestions for us, we would look for that. So thank you, everyone. We will send out that email with a copy of the slide deck and actually a recording of this conversation. Thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you also, Elizabeth and Bryn,
Thanks.
and everyone for participating. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful
Bye.
afternoon.
Thanks, Frank.
All right, so I hope.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Okay.
We had, I think, we still have